Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, comrades and compañeros, welcome back to the Moynihan Report here on the Two-Way Network. I'm your host, Michael Moynihan. Today, I thought we'd do something. I mean, those of you who have been longtime listeners, particularly of the Fifth Column, the other show that I do, I get a lot of email on these kind of narrow subjects that I dip my toe into. And periodically over there for years, I've been interviewing historians. I kind of did a series of interviews with historians of people that I find fascinating, smart, who are kind of moving the ball and changing the direction on particular areas of historiography. But this is very similar to that, but slightly different in one way. I've been increasingly concerned about the infiltration in American politics and mainstream American politics of a particular type of revisionism. And we're not going to get deep into that, not the sort of Holocaust revisionism stuff, et cetera, but what we would in American politics call the kind of Buchananite strain. These very popular podcasters, as I've mentioned a number of times before, the Tucker Carlsons of the world, having on these amateur historians who tell you that Winston Churchill was the great villain of World War II. You presume if he was the villain, maybe the other guy was the good guy, and weird associations that these people have in their professional lives with various other kind of neo-Nazi types. But there's a lot of this stuff about, and there's a lot of conversation, particularly about Nazism, the Second World War. It was, I did a thing over at the Free Press a while ago about the word fascism, the definition of fascism, where it's applied and misapplied. And that's a slightly different thing, because now we're actually talking about the Second World War. We're talking about, war culpability. It's a very strange and surprising argument. And it's usually done by people who don't know very much. So what I am here to do for you, ladies and gentlemen, is to find people who know a lot about this stuff. So I called upon someone whose book, I got to say, for Professor Brendan Sims of Cambridge in the UK, I'm going to tell him this in the lead-in, that I bought the Kindle copy of the book, and then I bought the print copy just to hold it up, so he gets two. It's going to be a very good Christmas in the Sims household, because I bought a second book, and that's Hitler, A Global Biography by Brendan Sims. A recent book also with a co-author about Pearl Harbor and Hitler. It's a lot of kind of overlap in these books because there's a focus in a lot of ways about America. And I found this book to be, and I hate these words, provocative. For me, it's kind of the thing that I had been thinking, reading about this stuff for 30 years, and it was kind of crystallized by Brendan in this book. So, Professor Brendan Smith, thank you so much for joining me. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for asking me.
If you don't mind, I'm going to start in a broad way, because you've written a number of books on a number of subjects, but I have heard you comment on this. I don't think it's kind of out of bounds, but as a historian, it must be very frustrating to kind of look across the Atlantic. I think a little bit of it is happening in the UK, and it has always been there in politics. If it's AfD in Germany or Front National in France, there's always these kind of arguments. Jean-Marie Le Pen very famously said the Holocaust was a detail of history. But when you see this happening and bubbling up in American politics now, and very influential people with very, very big platforms and podcasts saying things like, I think Churchill was the villain of the Second World War and not the hero, and we've gotten this story wrong. How do you react to that, and why do you think that this stuff is bubbling up now?
Well, I'm obviously very alarmed by this. I'm alarmed at two levels. First of all, because of the lack of historical knowledge it implies, as you alluded to earlier, and we'll probably go into that a bit more in a minute. But secondly, because it's indicative of a particular political or geopolitical mindset. So if you're attacking the received view of the Second World War in this way, and of course everybody's entitled to revise, historians are always engaging in revision, that's completely legitimate. But in doing it in this way, what you are really doing is you are attacking the global framing, which underpins, for example, our Western opposition to the illegal invasion of Ukraine. It attacks what I hope would be a common Western position to contain the People's Republic of China, although some of these critics are more robust on that, thankfully. So it's a threat, really, to our common Western worldview. And they know that. They realize it's provocative, and they revel in it.
Mm-hmm. When people, I mean, there's another aspect of this, and there's a certain kind of Anglophobia to it too. When you have from guys like Pat Buchanan, and the other argument that I've seen recently. Now this is bubbling up. Now I have to, fight with people about this, and I actually recommended to someone recently who was making this argument to me to read Ian Kershaw's book, Fateful Choices, which is actually quite good on this, is that the idea that, the Second World War didn't need to happen. Mm-hmm. If we had stayed out in America, this is a couple of years later, and if the Brits had just accepted these peace treaties that were very well-intentioned and very well-meaning from Adolf Hitler after the Munich crisis, all could have been, fine. The spasm of violence, maybe even the Holocaust wouldn't have happened. I mean, these are some pretty wild out there theories, but this is a mainstream view in certain precincts, particularly on the American right now. I'm sure we could probably get people on the American left to say it too. But how do you respond to that as somebody who's written this, 800-page biography of Hitler? That decision-making around that time, we could have placated Hitler and all of this would have gone away, but the war-hungry British and ultimately the war-hungry Americans made it all happen.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think there is something to the argument that the British fought on at a time and in a way in 1940 which seemed quixotic and forlorn.
Yeah.
There's also something to the argument that the war with the United States had deep implications for the European Jewry. In fact, that's a major argument, both of my Hitler book and of the book on Pearl Harbor with Charlie Lederman. Where these critics are mistaken is in the thought that the Americans, and particularly President Roosevelt, brought the United States into the war. Because, of course, the historical record is very different. It was Japan which attacked at Pearl Harbor, and it was Hitler who declared war on the United States. So unlike, say, Wilson in the First World War, where indeed he does go to Congress and ask for a declaration of war, proactively, admittedly provoked by the Germans, in the case of the Second World War, it's Hitler who needlessly declares war on America. Now, you can argue that he was provoked, and of course, the discourse that you mentioned would argue that. But it still involves a huge amount of aggressive behavior on Hitler's behalf. And of course, none of us can know, even if Hitler had been appeased in the way that these critics demand, who knows where Hitler would have gone next. So I think that they basically have got it back to front.
I'm going to ask you a question that has, plagued the amateur for many years, and I remember it coming up from I think it was a teacher in high school who said, the Germans declare war on the United States after the attack on Pearl Harbor. This is December 7th. The declaration was the 10th or 11th or something?
11th.
It was 11th.
Yeah.
And I remember this teacher was a high school class. He said, this is the great mystery. Yeah. Why Hitler would do something so reckless and stupid and invite a big, mighty army like the United States to fight it too. Mm-hmm. Which so many people in the United States and Congress were fighting vehemently against the America First Committee, which of course closed its doors on the day after, on December 10th, it shuts down. You wrote this book and a book about Hitler and Pearl Harbor. Did you come to some kind of conclusion that made any sense to you of why that declaration of war happened?
Yes, we came to a very clear conclusion, and I should preface my remarks by saying that I'm going to try to explain Hitler's rationality.
Yeah.
without myself sharing his motivation.
Yes, yeah.
So the trick really is to get into Hitler's mind without letting him get into your own mind. Yeah. And that's quite a fine balance to try to strike as an historian. But from our perspective, as indeed your school friend said, his decision is bizarre. Here you have a man who's already at war with the British Empire, which wasn't going terribly well. Then he declared war on the Soviet Union or invaded the Soviet Union in late June 1941, and that's not going well either. So what kind of lunatic, we ask ourselves, would then add the United States, which is the greatest power on earth economically, and of course had shown that in the First World War, who would add such an enemy to the lists? Now, one possible explanation might be, well, Hitler doesn't understand just how powerful the United States is. He's ignorant. He thinks the United States is decadent. But in fact, the opposite is the case. Hitler declares war on the United States, not because he is unafraid of American power, but because he's afraid of American power. He understands exactly how strong the United States is or will be. But his concern, his belief, is that the United States has been taken over by an Anglophile and pro-Jewish and sometimes Jewish elite. So that's the sort of mindset he is in, which in some ways is not unlike the mindset of the people you cited at the beginning, which is so worrying. And his view is that really the United States is governed by a form of false consciousness. The United States is not seeing the truth. The truth from his point of view is that there is a deal to be struck between the United States, the German Reich, probably the British Empire, where we could simply divvy up the world. Each would stay within its own lane, its own space. And they're just not seeing that for the second time in history, because they didn't see it, of course, during the First World War either. Who is to blame for that? To blame for that is an internationalist elite, many of them sort of Wall Street bankers, Anglophiles, and of course the Jews. Mm. So in declaring war on the United States on the 11th of December, he is doing really two things. First of all, he is reacting to Pearl Harbor, because the only pathway that he can see to victory or to even to some kind of stalemate is to exploit the distraction of the United States and the British Empire in the Far East to close the deal in Russia, to come to some kind of arrangement with the British, and then basically control a continental European space, which will enable him to outlast a putative Anglo-American blockade. He cannot allow the Japanese to go down to defeat. And so secondly, he is engaging in then in his view, a preemptive strike on the United States, which he believes will be coming into the war anyway. Yeah. And a corollary of that, which we might come to later on, is he then steps up the war against the Jews, as he calls it. We would call it the mass murder of the Jews, by then moving to the full-scale killing not merely of the Soviet Jews, most of whom are dead, but of the Central and Western European Jews who are under his control, who are being very badly treated, but most of whom are still alive at this point.
I mean, not wrong in the sense that the British government at that time, and through various William Stevenson and the BSC that are operating in the United States out of here, and I'm in New York City in Rockefeller Center, trying desperately to get the Americans into the war. Such kind of creative, dirty trickery that I'm deeply impressed by it to fight isolationism. So I'm not sure if this would have happened anyway, not my specialty, but I think that there's an interesting thing you said, like the people that I mentioned before, these kind of American political figures now. And I have argued pretty strenuously in the past about comparing contemporary America to the Weimar Republic, for instance, in which there's bloodletting on the streets and the KPD, and SA troops are fighting and killing each other in big numbers too. We're not at that point, and I don't like the use of the word fascist, which I think is imprecise and so flabby and baggy at this point that I had someone actually say to me on a TV show when I objected to the comparison. They said, well, fascism is not just Hitler. And I'm like, you're not talking about Franco here. You're trying to make people think of one person. So I don't love these comparisons. That said, what you just pointed out, the people who now talk endlessly about Israel, they talk endlessly about anti-Zionism. They talk endlessly about globalism, right? So globalism is, this, or the deep state, something very similar. Shadowy figures, shadowy bankers, which is why I think the tie to and why I was focusing on this book, because I had long noticed this when reading kind of the speeches from that. I think one of the things that not first really convinced me is the historian, and I recommend listeners and viewers buy this book after only you buy Brendan's book, is Peter Longerich, who wrote a very good biography of Goebbels, in which the first 500 pages is, you would think it was a Marxist university professor. I mean, a man on the left of the party, and if those of you don't know, there was a left wing of the Nazi party, the Strasser brothers, who were these famous kind of leftists. Goebbels, very, very left wing, and in complaining to Hitler about things that ruin the socialism of a particular program. And this is as late as 1930 and 31. You kind of crystallized that in this book, that Adolf Hitler's real focus is not to discount Bolshevism, Judeo-Bolshevism, etc., is the United States and anti-capitalism, which is something that if you pay a lot of attention, you notice this all the time. Now, I know we have political debates about this, whether the Nazis left-wing or right-wing, completely irrelevant in a stupid political debate for contemporary purposes. But I have noticed that so many of the people on that side of the American argument today have gone kind of left on economics. Steve Bannon is, a socialist as far as, he told me after I interviewed him one time how much he loved AOC. Tucker Carlson has drifted away. They hate this libertarian Cato Institute, free market stuff. And so I do see these parallels, which are kind of curious. Talk to me a little bit about that focus. You're not the first person to have written about it, but you're the first person to have kind of focused it on the Anglo-American thing, particularly American thing, and anti-capitalism. Why do you think that anti-capitalism is one of the sort of main motivating features of Hitler's ideology?
Yeah, well, to be clear, Hitler had a very strong aversion to communism and a very strong aversion to the Soviet Union. But what I argue in the book is that his fear of and hatred of the United States, the British Empire, and international capitalism was even greater. It was also periodically a love-hate relationship, so it's a complex relationship. But he's much, much more worried about British and American power than he is about Soviet power. And he's much more afraid of international capitalism than he is of communism. In fact, he regards communism, along with many other isms, socialisms, trade unionism, and so on, as instruments which are used by the forces of international capitalism to break down national economies and make them subject to the forces of international capitalism, which are both Jewish and non-Jewish. He specifically says that. Yeah. But obviously, anti-Semitism is a large part of this, but it is not just about anti-Semitism. Now, the reason why he thinks this is actually perfectly straightforward. It is true that the British Empire and the United States, taken together in the 1920s and 1930s, definitely have the preponderance of power in the world. Hitler was not alone in thinking that. That's a reasonable proposition. And it is also true that international capitalism was a very, very powerful force, the most powerful force, certainly than the other forces out there like Soviet communism and so on. Now, I personally think that was and is a good thing. Not everybody agrees with me. That in itself is not a bizarre belief. But he then sort of escalates that belief to a whole worldview which blames all the ills of Germany on this Anglo-American elite and on international Jewry in a way which strips out many, many other factors. That's where it becomes incredible and noxious. Of course, he is, to a considerable extent, reacting to his own biography. He has fought in the First World War for 4 years. Most of that time was spent fighting the British. He has got a huge respect for the British. He thinks they're the toughest race, basically, in the world. He thinks the Anglo-Saxons are the true master race. He thinks that the Germans have, in a sense, degenerated over the centuries and, in fact, need living space in the East to provide themselves with that sort of racial energy and quality which the British and later the Americans have acquired through their control of large amounts of the world's surface. So he comes out of that war, at the tail end of which, by the way, he also has to confront American soldiers, whom he believes to be German immigrants. We might go into that in a minute. But he comes out of the First World War convinced, not unreasonably, of the overwhelming power of Anglo-America and international capitalism, which he blames for the war. Then he experiences the Versailles settlement, he experiences the reparations regime, he experiences the occupation by the French and the Belgians, all those things which basically turn Germany, in his parlance, into a colony. In fact, he talks about Germany in highly racialized terms. He compares the Germans to the non-white peoples who've been colonized. And so that is why concern with Anglo-America is front and center. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, is the product of a sickness. So the reason why he fears Bolshevism is as a sickness which will disintegrate Germany, has disintegrated Germany through the revolutionary activities of 1918 and delivered up Germany to the forces of the Entente and international capitalism. So these are all reasons why he's much more afraid of the British Americans and international capitalism than he is of the Soviet Union and Bolshevism.
I mean, it's an interesting thing, considering, the Munich Soviet after the war and the violence that was associated with it. And, the presumption that all of these people are being directed by Moscow, that this is literally right in your country now. And then there's other Soviets popping up and violently being put down after the First World War. But, one of the interesting things is, I get the the idea and the argument of what the Soviet Union represents. But if you're looking at Hitler's speeches, if you're an average person picking up a copy of the Völkische Beobachter and reading, the Nazi newspaper, what is the difference if you're an anti-capitalist and if you talk about capital in that way, in the United States, in international finance capital, in Jewish capital, et cetera? Mm-hmm. What is the kind of ideological distinction when you're also talking about Bolshevismus, about Bolshevism, Marxism, not socialism, that's never coming up. But Marxism, Bolshevism are denounced in just a blanket way. Explain to somebody who might not understand how you can be a kind of pretty open and rock-ribbed anti-capitalist denouncing kind of bankers in international finance and also be denouncing Marxism and Bolshevism.
Mm-hmm. So Hitler described himself as a socialist. Now, he was not, of course, a socialist in any meaningful sense of the word today. So, or even in the past, say, people like Willy Brandt or any other, present-day socialist leader in Europe, or dare I say it, in the United States. Yeah. So I'm not saying this in order to blacken socialism. I'm just saying that he regarded himself as a socialist because he believed that nationalism and socialism essentially went together, that you could not be a nationalist and a capitalist, because if you're a capitalist, you're essentially international. He used that phrase. He didn't actually use the phrase globalist, but the nomenclature is very similar. They actually mean more or less the same thing, which also tells you something interesting about present-day debates. And Hitler is not against all forms of capitalism. That's why I always stressed his real enemy was international capitalism. He specifically says on a number of occasions, I'm in favor of national capitalism, by which he means companies which are rooted in the German Reich, companies like Krupp, for example, they are okay from his point of view. International capitalism, Wall Street, finance, those are the real enemies. And so that's the way in which the anti-communism and the anti-capitalism can be reconciled in his mind. And he specifically says that the concern with Bolshevism is that it's subversive, as I said earlier. It's basically, it's breaking down national economies and weakening them in the face of this international threat.
And is there a racial element of that too, of that the German folk don't matter in an internationalist communist context, whereas the racial purity in blood and these blood and soil kind of stuff doesn't matter at all to communism, or doesn't seem to matter at all. Is that a part of it too?
Yes. So communism, in his mind, is sort of negation of, because it's internationalist, is a negation of nationalism. But he doesn't regard the Soviet Union after a certain point as irredeemably Bolshevik. So one or at least for a while not. So one thing that's interesting is when Litvinov is got rid of as foreign secretary and Molotov comes in, this is taken by Hitler as a sign that Stalin is moving away from Jewish communism to a more nationalistic model, which, although a cockeyed view of the world, is not completely ridiculous at some level. And this is a huge problem, by the way, when you're studying these phenomena, because there will always be, or there will often be, some kernel of truth or plausibility to the story. And then you've got to, but the overall interpretation is just completely bizarre. And you've got to try and trace how you get from what appears to be reasonable to something that is fantastical.
Another really fascinating thing, and before we started recording, I mentioned this speech that I had, which isn't in translation, so I'm laboriously translating it on my own, from 1927 in Oldenburg that Hitler gives, and one of the main features of the speech, which is something that no one pays attention to except your book. I mean, I've seen it in things here and there. It was the opposite of today because it's about the outflow. It's about immigration, about people leaving. And there's an enormous part of this speech, which, good Lord, I don't know, timing how long these things are, because unbelievable. It's, 30 pages. And there's a long bit about Germans emigrating to America. Now, I think one of the most completely almost unknown and forgotten film from 1934, which I recommend because it's one of the only films that's shot on the streets of New York in 1934 during the Depression. It's a phenomenal and very, very strange nationalist film called The Prodigal Son, the Verlorene. And the film is the guy who used to make mountain movies, these climbing movies from Austria. And The Prodigal Son is a story of a German who leaves a Tyrolean, or an Austrian who leaves a Tyrolean village to emigrate to America, and the horrors that befall him when he's there. And it is, I mean, people know Leni Riefenstahl and, these sort of common Triumph of the Will, stuff like this. This is one of the most interesting propaganda films because it is about people leaving their Heimat, their fatherland, and going to America and discovering the rapacious capitalists who don't care about them. And then they have to, I'm not spoiling it for you, people come home to a pagan ceremony in the kind of mountains in the Tyrolean Alps. And it's an absolutely fascinating film. And there's so much to that thought, right? That one of the things that drove people like Adolf Hitler crazy was the outflow of Germans to the United States. That features very heavily in your book. I mean, talk about why you decided to sort of recenter that story, which I don't even say recenter. I don't know if it's been centered very much by many historians at all, and why you think that's an important part of his thinking.
Thank you. Yes, it's absolutely central. I haven't seen the film you mentioned, but I assume it's by Louis Trenker.
It's Louis Trenker, yeah.
So he famous because, of course, he knew Leni Riefenstahl very well, and his most famous film was Berge in Flammen.
Yeah.
First World War, which I have seen, but I'm sorry not to have seen. I'm very grateful to you, by the way, for the steer, because what you
I have a copy of it. I can upload for you. But in one final, in addition to this, there's another. He's done a couple of these. Another film that I think is from the late 30s called Der Kaiser von California, the Kaiser of California.
Yeah, that's about
which is also very similar, thematically very similar, of a German going in. But that one is more positive, that it is the Germans that create the greatness and the wealth in America. It's us. You should come back home, is implied.
Yeah, that's about Sutter, which I had come across.
Yeah.
And the themes are exactly as you've described them. And the significance of it hasn't been recognized, in my opinion, by any previous biographer, or indeed by the historiography in general. And the reason why it's so important is because it explains, first of all, his relationship with the United States, which, as I said, is a love-hate relationship, but essentially one of fear and respect. The fear then beginning to outweigh the respect. So what Hitler believes is that the German Reich has been fragmented since the early modern period, since roughly 1500 or the 1520s, by the forces of religious strife between Catholics and Protestants, by the forces of territorial particularism, the tendency to fragment, and then subsequently, of course, by other forces like liberalism, political Catholicism, then socialism, then communism, and so on. But the real origin of all of this, as I say, is the early modern period, when Germany basically turned in on itself, and the British Empire in particular expanded overseas. And then, of course, the United States was founded. And this is vital, Hitler says, because we, the Germans, so his argument, failed then to secure the necessary living space to feed our demographic overflow. What happens to people that you cannot feed? They emigrate.
Yeah.
They go to the British Empire, and particularly to the new United States, which is true, by the way. Millions of Germans go. I mean, until certainly 20 years ago, German Americans were the largest single ethnic group in your union.
Yeah.
Hitler's argument also is, and this is generally not realized, although I talk about it a lot in the book, is that immigrants tend to be of higher quality than the people left behind. So what Hitler is saying, implicitly, but often also explicitly, is that the best Germans have emigrated. They are in the United States. What is left in Germany is, I'm putting this slightly strongly, is the dregs. Mm-hmm. And so what is the danger of this? Well, the danger is that in the case of a world war, these emigrants will return as enemy soldiers. And for him, exhibit A of this phenomenon was the First World War, when, as he says, German soldiers were being killed by munitions being produced by German engineers in American factories. And American soldiers, many of them of German descent, came over to France to fight him. And I found it in the archives in Munich, actually a document that said Private or Corporal, Private First Class or Corporal Hitler dropped off 2 American prisoners at brigade headquarters. And he refers to that incident, which is documented from July 1918. He refers to it again on multiple occasions in the 1920s. And what he says, it's folded into the kind of speech that you've mentioned. Yeah. What he says is that I encountered these Americans on the battlefields of France in 1918. They were all tall, blonde, and blue-eyed. Whether they were or not, I don't know. Mm-hmm. But this is what he said. And they are the children of the immigrants, and they have come back to fight the fatherland. Now, what, allowing, of course, that this is just his view, I'm not saying this is true, but I'm summarizing his argument. If this is the case, what is the remedy? Well, the remedy is to prevent emigration, One way of preventing it is by trying to dissuade people, hence the films by Louis Trenker and others, hence a propaganda effort to say, well, everything is gold over in the United States, which in itself tells you a lot, because nobody's trying to persuade people not to emigrate to the Soviet Union, because nobody in their right minds would do that, apart from a few deluded people who many of them are killed and soon regret their decision. You have to make an argument against the United States, because most reasonable people think in Germany and elsewhere that the United States is the model place, and ideally you'd like to go there. Secondly, you need to have the same kind of space as the British and the Americans, to which you can export your demographic overflow. Hence, Lebensraum, living space. And Hitler says that has got to be in the East, because we cannot be overseas, because if it's overseas, the Royal Navy will cut us off like they did in the First World War, and we will have no benefit from it. And that is the long-term rationale behind Operation Barbarossa. The locating of Lebensraum in the Soviet Union is not because they are Bolsheviks as such. It's because they are Bolsheviks, they are weak. And because they are contiguous, they can be easily reached. And so seeking living space in the East is actually directed against the British and the Americans as a strategy to overcome the damage to the German Reich through this demographic outflow. And just to round off that point, Michael, I just want to share with your viewers a particularly curious episode from July 1944. It's in the immediate aftermath of the Normandy landings. It's at the height of the big Soviet offensive, Operation Bagration, which tears the heart out of the Eastern Front. Hitler sits down with the leaders of German industry, and they're all very glum for obvious reasons, not least because also the Anglo-American bombers are basically pulverizing Germany's cities and Germany's industry. And he says to them, don't worry, I know you're all thinking about those German engineers in America producing against us, but fear not, I too have German engineers. Which is a very weird thing to say, unless you bear in mind that whole intellectual worldview framework, which I've just cited, which of course explains it fully.
Yeah, and also if you had presumed that those people who would end up working on the Manhattan Project were themselves Germans,
well, that's,
not a separate
an irony
category.
Which he perhaps wasn't aware of.
Yeah, perhaps not. But let me just ask you a kind of, maybe not a simple question, sounds like a simple question. There's so much talk. I mean, you've written two very detailed books on the Third Reich period in general, very specific in certain places too. But there's no other area of history. I mean, it used to be a bit about the Soviet period and about the Cold War, where it was so common to be invoked in the current political discourse, or even Hollywood films made out of television shows. There's always thematically, something from the Second World War. Right? As a historian of this period, and having done this book and the most recent one, when you look out there and you see people having these discussions, and they're usually misinformed, first of all, it must drive you crazy. I mean, I can't imagine if somebody was a dentist, hearing the average person talk about dentistry, nothing about it on TV and on the subway and on the streets and in editorials. But what is the thing that is most frequently misunderstood and people most frequently get wrong, which leads to sort of ricochet bad conclusions? We had the other day, and many times, because there's nothing that Tucker Carlson won't call into question now. I think it's part of his anti-deep state project. They are lying to you, right? And one of those was that, Pearl Harbor was a setup. I mean, obviously FDR knew about this, and it was to sink our entire fleet and kill 3,000 people to get involved in a war, and then presume that the Nazis would declare war a few days later. But there are things like that. But is there something you keep seeing pop up in these conversations that as a historian of the period drives you a bit batty?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's frustrating, of course. I mean, I welcome in general the popular interest in history, and I do believe I do have a democratic view of history, and I'm, you know, in general, I'm content for people to obviously express their views and challenge received orthodoxy. Where I think, to answer your question about the one single factor, where I think people go wrong is, in this particular case, is in their determination to have an overarching answer to everything, a single framework. And this is where I think anti-Semitism is so important, so different, and so dangerous. It is different from many other forms of prejudices. You know, anti-Semitism is more than just a prejudice. It's a worldview.
Yeah.
And the people who are anti-Semitic in the sort of all-encompassing sense think that they have actually hacked the world. They understand the world, and those who are not anti-Semitic are suffering from a form of false consciousness or of a lack of insight. And so they believe there is this great big framework. So it's perfectly reasonable to argue, although it may not be true, that there were elements within the American government who wanted to enter the war. I think Roosevelt certainly did want to take on Hitler. I don't think it's true that he knew about Pearl Harbor or set up Pearl Harbor in that way. It's certainly the case that the British attempted by hook or by crook to get the Americans into the war, as you said earlier. So all of that is true. But to get from that to, you know, a conspiracy to have Pearl Harbor, a conspiracy, you know, to subvert the will of the American people, and so on and so forth, that's a whole new step. So, you know, I tend to think if the world were really run by the Jews, the world would not be such a mess.
Yeah,
you get my drift.
I do, and it's pretty interesting when you see in this country the perceptions, particularly amongst young people, of Israel going from, you know, 60, 70, 80% to, you know, it feels like in certain areas of almost single digits. And it always makes me wonder and ask people in response if the Jews and the Israelis control the narrative, and you're not allowed to say this, that, and the other, and the Jews control the media. They're doing a really terrible job at this point, and I would expect them to do better than that. I mean, but I think that's right also, that the flattening of complications, you know, kind of almost inviting the anti-Semitic, because it always makes people feel, it makes very, very dumb people feel clever, right? It makes them feel like they understand something that you don't understand, and that you can talk about almost any issue. I was saying to a friend the other day, there was a series of tragedies this weekend in the United States and in Australia, a shooting at Brown University, the murder of the film director Rob Reiner, and the killings at Bondi Beach in Australia. And I said to a friend, if you go on Twitter or X or whatever you call it now, you can play not even 6 degrees of separate, 2 degrees of anti-Semitism. And you can find, and yeah, sure, it's some random person, but some of them are big accounts. Some of them get a lot of attention. The connection, how long it takes to get to Israel. And I said, how would they do that with Rob Reiner? Well, apparently Rob Reiner had done a thing recently about the JFK assassination. And he said, oh, I figured it out. He seemed like a very nice guy. You know, I don't think he figured it out. But of course, there was someone in there saying, you know, he probably figured it out, that it was Mossad that was responsible because they wanted AIPAC to file as a foreign in the FARA registration. And it's so convoluted. And I said, my friend, you've done it. 2, 3 posts down, you connected Rob Reiner to Israel. It is an all-encompassing view, and it is an all-encompassing hatred that makes people feel smart and clever, and their failures are understood as the ubiquity of somebody else. I mean, it's an absolutely fascinating thing that after the largest slaughter of Jews since the Second World War, there has been an uptick in anti-Semitism. I suppose you should have, we understood that after 9/11, that anti-Americanism went through the roof after 9/11. There was a moment of sympathy, and people always reference this Le Monde editorial, "We Are All Americans." I recommend people read it, because before you get to the "We All Americans," it says, you kind of deserve this for all the stuff you do in the Middle East and your support of Israel. It has a lot of throat clearing. But I wanted to ask you one final thing, Professor Sims, because I was unaware of this. I was looking through your very impressive body of work, and I found out you wrote a book about Donald Trump's worldview.
Yes, I co-authored it with Charlie Lederman. In fact, the
same co-author, right?
Yeah, the co-author of the book on Hitler and Pearl Harbor. It's actually a collection of documents of Donald Trump's own statements prior to 2016. Many of them going back to his famous letter in the New York Times in 1987. And then with our added commentary. And our basic argument was that Donald Trump needs to be taken seriously as somebody who has a coherent worldview around, American allies as basically parasites, and as the problems of the the U.S. economy as being a result of being taken advantage of by outside actors, particularly
his only consistent worldview in his life, right? His protectionism and pro-tariff sentiments.
Yeah. So that is a very clear line that runs all the way through, and that we were trying to say, whether you agree with this or not, and one can see in certain aspects of what he's arguing, you can see where he's coming from, and it's not a ridiculous argument. Personally, I disagree with it, but it's an argument. And what we were pushing back against was the idea that, in this respect at least, Donald Trump was somehow an opportunist and a weather vane. What we were saying was he may be a bit crude or very crude in some cases, but there is a coherence. And actually, we've seen this feeding through in many respects. I mean, there were aspects of what we predicted that didn't materialize. So, one isn't right.
What do you think? I mean, and by the way, absolutely nobody has even close to a perfect record on this stuff. So this is in no way a criticism. But what did you get wrong? In hindsight, you said, that turned out not to be exactly right.
Yeah, so what I expected was an abandonment of the European allies, in particularly Eastern Europe. And actually the opposite happened. It may have been much more the administration rather than him personally, but it's absolutely the case that the policy towards Russia was much tougher under the first Trump administration than it was under Obama. That's absolutely clear. So my expectation there was mistaken. I was glad to be mistaken. I'm happy to admit it. I'm sorry that he hasn't maintained that robust attitude in his second administration.
Yeah.
The things we got right were the focus on trade, the attacks on allies, and several other aspects, which sadly, that through line has continued to the present day.
I said that would probably be my last question. I'll let you go, but I lied. I have one more for you, because I just got a book, a translation of the German historian Volker Ulrich, who wrote Hitler Biography and has a new book about the Weimar Republic. And it's an interesting book. It's driving me crazy in a lot of ways, because at the outset, there's a lot of talk about Donald Trump or references to it, et cetera. And I remember a long time ago, the historian Ted Morgan wrote a book called Reds, and it was a book about communism in America, the McCarthy period, a pretty good book. But at the end, this was in probably 2003 or 4 when this came out, and I think it was a reissue of the book. It goes into this long, bizarre thing about George W. Bush, which just completely ruined the moment and the book for me. And the Volker Ulrich thing, I'm just like, it's about the Weimar Republic. If you want to write an editorial for Die Welt or Süddeutsche Zeitung, like, great. But that intrusion into the book was like pretty jarring for me. What do you think, or do you have any ideas about this stuff? Because you have written about Donald Trump, and you write for the New Statesman, and you write for various newspapers, of the kind of borderlines between being a historian and a sort of pundit in the contemporary political debate. I mean, how do you think about that?
Well, it's a really good question. I've reflected on that a lot, and I'm not sure I have a very satisfactory or conclusive answer, because in the end it's a question of judgment.
Yeah.
And so as an historian, the added value you bring is perspective and historical understanding. And that can be very helpful, but it can sometimes also lead you in the wrong direction. And I think in the case of Donald Trump, personally, I'm not a huge fan of the president, but I don't think he's a Nazi, and I don't think he's a fascist in a meaningful sense of the word. I agree with you that the use of that term is highly inflationary in an unhelpful way. But, as Tolstoy said, all happy families are the same, but unhappy families are unhappy in their different way. The United States is obviously very unhappy at the moment. I think he is contributing to that. And the form of unhappiness is sui generis. It is a particular form of American unhappiness, which I don't think maps, despite some parallels in the kind of figures you mentioned earlier on who are definitely anti-Semitic, but I don't think it maps onto Weimar. So I haven't read Volker Ulrich's book. I liked his work on Hitler very much, but I think from what you say, it was probably ill-advised to mix in that with the history, because I think it potentially will lead people astray and put off people who would otherwise read the book.
And perhaps I don't want to be unfair to him, perhaps, because I just started the book. I mean, perhaps it evens out. And, when you're talking about...
I'm sure it will, yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure if you're talking about 1925, 1926, you're not going to start dropping in Trump references. But I need you to help me on one thing. I get a lot of emails, after an episode like this, where people will ask me for book recommendations. So they understand the first book recommendation is Professor Brendan Sims's book. So this is just, we understand this. But so I can prevent them from emailing me about this, you give the advice to somebody who, in the Nazi period, or if it's a book about Hitler and you're going to exclude your own books, what would you recommend someone pick up if they're trying to kind of make sense of this period, which keeps on infiltrating our current debate?
Well, I think a very good book on Hitler in America is by Klaus Schmieder, which looks at some of the themes I've been talking about, but amplifies very considerably the whole military dimension, and in particular the back and forth in the Battle of the Atlantic and other areas. So if I had to recommend one book, it would be by Klaus Schmieder.
That's a very surprising answer, Professor Sims. I assumed it would be the Ian Kershaw book or something. You went deep on that one.
Well, I sort of assume also people know Ian Kershaw. People might not have heard of Klaus Schmieder. And I think they're both both worth reading. So if you're giving me the opportunity to cite two books, happily include Ian Kershaw.
Yeah, I didn't mean to nudge you towards Kershaw. I'm not on the payroll of Ian Kershaw.
But you could absolutely, I would recommend them doing that. Yeah.
All right. Well, you can buy both of those books. Actually, well, that would be three books because the Kershaw's two books. Yeah. But don't do it until you buy Hitler, a Global Biography by Professor Brendan Sims. I mean, not the most recent book, but if you like this, go buy the other ones too. I mean, look at behind him. He has more books to buy himself. These aren't free, although probably a lot of them are review copies. But Brendan Sims, we really, really appreciate it. That was fantastic, enlightening, and would love to have you back. So thank you for your time. And for the rest of you, I was going to say we'll be back next week. Actually, won't be back next week because we're going to be celebrating Christmas. We're doing Hanukkah because my last name's Moynihan. But next week we are going to be out, but we have a ton of good stuff coming after that. So stay tuned, and if you're jonesing, go over to the Moynihan Report at YouTube and subscribe and all that good stuff. And we will see you, I think, in the new year. I'm not saying we're going to get canceled, but I think maybe before that. I don't know. But very, very soon, we shall see you soon. Bye.